These days, the shadow of war has fallen over the country more than ever before, and naturally all the military officials are stepping up, showcasing their various achievements or even quite logically exaggerating them. This is to show that we have enough power, and if a foreign country were to attack us, we would be able to defend ourselves. Air defense drills, ground force exercises, unveiling of missile cities, and now, in the latest project unveiled by the IRGC, the introduction of the IRGC's floating city and the disclosure of a new frigate. Greetings to you all. I'm Elias Farok here on Persian Trend, and in this video, we're going to examine the IRGC's new floating city together to see to what extent it's truly a valuable achievement and where it might have been exaggerated, and ultimately we'll gather some information about the IRGC's floating city, which might be the first of its kind in the world. Before we start the explanations, let's first see what exactly we're going to talk about. Let's watch the IRIB report about the IRGC's floating city, and then we'll analyze it together.
Flying over the Persian Gulf alongside the commander of the IRGC Navy heading toward an undisclosed location.
The first camera is essentially your camera. You are in fact our very first reporter.
The IRGC Navy maintains vessels like this one, which is called Zulfiqar. The missile is the size and specialty of hitting American destroyers and aircraft carriers. And now, with significant upgrades to the weapon systems of the Zulfiqar boats and their cruise missiles, they have been equipped with even more powerful high-explosive warheads. Now, just 3 Zulfiqar boats alone are capable of
Strait is also
destroying an enemy aircraft carrier.
In the words of the Americans themselves, as they say, they call our vessels red wasps.
Meaning if they sting, that ship is definitely going to sink.
Yeah, it's a deadly sting. These have advanced radar evading capabilities, and among their features are their very high speed and extremely shallow draft.
At once launching missiles toward the target.
They are capable of launching their missiles at extremely high speeds.
The commander of the IRGC Navy made this point next to the force's new fast attack craft. It's a new vessel with a carbon hull that can launch its smart cruise missiles at speeds of at least 180 kilometers per hour. Because of the material and design of the Tare vessel's hull, enemy radars identify this vessel as a small fishing boat.
We wholeheartedly and sincerely assure the esteemed, dear, and great nation of Iran that the valiant, courageous, and honorable youth of this proud nation are fully capable, both in spirit and in skill, of engaging at sea in honorable, determined, and victorious confrontation with any and all enemies, whether they be small or large, regardless of the extent or nature of their capabilities or resources. These young men and women, driven by unwavering dedication and patriotism, stand ever ready to defend the dignity and sovereignty of their beloved homeland against any threat.
The Commander-in-Chief of the IRGC, during his visit to this underground IRGC Navy base, says, "Now, this force has the capability to confront threats even beyond the Persian Gulf."
The vast scale that we saw today is, in total, only a small part of the IRGC Navy's capabilities, which have been developed over the past years up to now. The development within the Navy has fundamentally been based on asymmetric warfare, in which the honor of action, both in the design of systems and in the tactics used to employ them, plays the leading and most important role.
Does this underground city have the capability to conduct operations at sea?
Exactly in the shortest possible time, and we accomplished all this under full sanctions. In fact, the more they sanctioned us, the more advanced we became. We keep getting more advanced.
From the very beginning, the IRGC Navy has faced sanctions, which is why its first units were formed by repurposing fishing boats, by mounting light weapons on them. Now, after those days, we've reached this point. The commander of the IRGC Navy says that this force now has the capability to carry out long-term naval operations against enemy destroyers along Iran's southern coasts. One of the elements of this force's power now is the underground cities for offensive vessels.
Any military force that, God forbid, wants to attack our country, or God forbid has its eyes on our land, will do so in a unique way. That is, every military force has its own specific profile. That's why we can't consider a general scenario that if our country were to be attacked, it would probably happen in a certain way. Especially when we're talking about the US and Israel, if the Israelis are going to attack first, it's almost certain that their attacks will be carried out by the Air Force, and the first targets will be the air defense rings or the radars. Then, of course, the other events that would likely follow in a domino effect. But if the Americans want to attack, the situation changes. If at any point the US sets its sights on our country and wants to launch an attack, the first force that will likely engage with the Americans is our Navy. It doesn't matter whether it's the Army Navy or the IRGC Navy. After all, the forces stationed in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman must be the first line of defense against foreign forces. So, just as our air defense sites or radars are important, our Navy on this side is also extremely important and can have a significant impact on how we confront a foreign country. Especially since we have a bitter experience of direct confrontation with the Americans, which happened at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, and in a single day, we lost a large portion of our Navy. That is, unfortunately, in one day, a significant part. I'm not going to state a percentage because it's hard to be precise, but a considerable portion of our Navy was completely destroyed and sunk. After that, various other incidents happened to our ships and vessels, but those are not the subject of this video. We won't be mentioning those. Let's move on to the topic of the floating city that has just been unveiled. So, up to this point, we've understood that the Navy is the first line of defense, and maintaining the Navy is extremely important. Having an underground city or an underground naval city is a very, very positive and good thing. Why do I say it's a positive and good thing? Because there might be a surprise attack, and if you are not adequately prepared, you could lose a significant portion of your Navy and essentially be left defenseless. Or you might not be able to carry out the scenario you had planned in advance. So moving them underground, just like we moved the missiles underground, or perhaps even the fighter jets, for example, is the same idea. It can be a very correct and rational move. Under any circumstances, we must be able to preserve our military equipment in the best possible way for a rainy day. And it shouldn't be the case that when we're unprepared or in non-combat situations, we lose them unexpectedly. So up to this point, let me emphasize that this move is a good one. But as for the claim that this floating city is being unveiled or used for the first time in the world, or that it's an Iranian invention, this is where some doubt can be cast on that claim. Why? For example, a country like Sweden at the end of World War II and during the Cold War used this very method to protect its navy, hiding a significant portion of its vessels in underground tunnels, caves, or other places that ultimately offered greater security, so that they wouldn't lose them in a surprise attack, and it was the right thing to do. So in practice, it's not something we can claim to have done for the first time, but maybe others haven't done it exactly the way we have. Why do I emphasize the way we have done it? because we usually have our own ideas. Sometimes our ideas are very creative. Sometimes our ideas can be unusual. And sometimes, even though they're unusual, they can also be creative. For example, when we're talking about a floating city, we typically expect there to be an underground tunnel where the vessels are hidden inside. But this city should be directly connected to the water so that whenever needed, these vessels can quickly reach the dock and get ready for operations as efficiently as possible. So far, that's all well and good, but what probably happened in this floating city we saw is that the floating city isn't actually next to the water, and there's some distance. Now, I don't know exactly how much this distance is or how long it takes for them to get these vessels operational for a specific military plan, but there is a distance, and having this distance can be both a strength and a weakness. From this perspective, it can be considered a strength because it's easier to maintain or easier to keep hidden. Or, well, that's one way we can look at it. But its weakness is also related to the issue of getting those vessels operational. Assume, for example, that if an attack were to be carried out against us, it's possible, I'm emphasizing possible, that the location of these vessels might have been exposed or identified by the US or Israel, and the only thing they would need to do is to bomb the exits of this floating city or the docks that this floating city is likely connected to, rendering them inoperable. In this way, at a certain point in time, we would not be able to use these vessels, and in effect, we would lose them again and they would become inoperable. Unless, of course, they have already considered a solution for this as well. Perhaps they've planned a secret underground passage, but even then, it would still fall under the same issue of information security or the risk of these entrances or exits being identified. So while it's a good idea, it can also be a risky one. The next point is about the choice of name for this floating city of the Revolutionary Guard. Thanks to the connections made through this very Pashkan trend channel, I was able to talk to a French Navy officer about the floating city and ask for his opinion. Honestly, when I was explaining the floating city of the Revolutionary Guard, maybe because of the words I chose or the words chosen by the Revolutionary Guard themselves, this Navy officer was really surprised. He said that when you say floating city, he imagined something like an American aircraft carrier, and he was surprised, asking if you really have something like that, or if the Revolutionary Guard has unveiled such a thing. It was very strange to him, and I was explaining, no, by floating city, I don't mean a city floating on water, but rather an underground city where the vessels are kept, and these two are different things. Maybe it was because of the limitations of the Persian language or a poor choice of words, or maybe I just conveyed my meaning to the poor guy incorrectly, but these two are different things. An underground floating city is completely different from a city floating on water, and they serve two entirely different purposes. And well, regarding this matter, he also explained to me that other countries have had similar ideas and that it was mostly used during the Cold War. The next point visible in these images was the considerable number of naval mines. I feel like these naval mines were deliberately displayed here, and perhaps the intention is related to the idea or issue of closing the Strait of Hormuz. Because, as you know, if the Strait of Hormuz is going to be closed by the army or the IRGC, it's not like our vessels would go and physically block the width of the strait and stop every ship trying to pass through. Most likely, they would heavily mine the area to make it unsafe for various ships, so that passing through there would either be impossible or the cost of crossing the Strait of Hormuz would become extremely high. In this way, they could create a disruption in the global economy. So if the Strait of Hormuz scenario is going to be carried out, it would probably look something like this. In my opinion, displaying these naval mines can only serve as a threat to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, as for how feasible this idea actually is, or whether the Americans have any solutions to clear or neutralize these naval mines, so that, unlike in the 1980s when they caused a lot of problems in the region, these mines won't be effective anymore, or whether they can stop them at all, or if they are still vulnerable to them, these questions remain. Overall, the idea of a floating city isn't a bad one and could be useful. But again, we come back to the same chicken and egg issue when it comes to the military matters of the Islamic Republic, or more broadly, Iran's military affairs. This is the claim that drones and missiles have replaced ground forces, air forces, or naval forces. And in a way, it's said that by developing missiles and engaging in asymmetric warfare, we're supposed to deter other countries or stop conventional armies. Well, this idea has its own supporters too. Just in the past few days, there's been a lot of controversy about these issues, and well, some friends and I have had a series of discussions about this matter. But pay attention, when we say that the Navy, the ground forces, the Air Force, and also the missile and drone units should all develop together at the same level, or at least roughly equally, what is that for? If we are supposed to be able to make an impact with our missile cities or our floating cities and be able to use them when we need to, it requires that the skies above them are secure. What does that mean? For example, if a serious scenario occurs and the Americans or Israelis are going to attack, or we are going to launch an attack against them, and these missile cities or floating cities are supposed to carry out operations, then certainly before these cities can carry out any operations, the Americans and Israelis will already have plans for them. Now, when it comes to missile cities, maybe the situation is a bit more complicated, but regarding the floating cities, since they have to be near the sea or close to the Persian Gulf or the Sea of Oman, they have a smaller range or more limited geographical options, and identifying them is much easier. Besides, they are very close to the border, and probably if the Americans or Israelis were to carry out an operation to disable them, it would be much easier for them to strike. I hope that regarding this matter, we no longer have any disagreements. Now, if we are going to use these floating cities and safely bring them into the sea, the sky above them must be secure. How can the sky above them be made secure? One way is air defense, and another very important way is air superiority. That's probably something we can all agree on. Unfortunately, due to our not so modern Air Force, we can't achieve this air superiority compared to the Americans and Israelis, and this is a very significant weakness. And if the Americans were to come and position themselves over these cities, ready to carry out operations, I think we would be highly vulnerable. And this is one of those issues that I have always emphasized on my own channel. That is, if we are going to use our missiles and drones, we must have adequate ground, naval, and air forces so that these weapons can actually be effective and deliver the intended blow in full. Now, I'll explain this, though some friends may not agree, and I hope my words are never proven right. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, and that one day in reality what I'm saying doesn't come true. That's honestly my wish, because if this happens, it will have irreversible consequences. There is a lot of emphasis on the fact that our military doctrine is based on asymmetric warfare. And if the Americans or Israelis are going to attack, we are supposed to stand against them using this approach we have chosen. Well, in some cases, this might be correct, and in some cases, it might not be. But the point is this: the military is not supposed to fight just two countries. That is, if you are supposed to protect all the borders, we have to be prepared for every scenario. And for example, asymmetric warfare doesn't work against armies similar to our own. It might work against the Americans. That is, for now, we want to use a hit-and-run scenario against the Americans, like hitting their destroyers or aircraft carriers, then hiding, and before they can react, we target another place and hide again. This method might work against America, but for example, against another country that isn't as powerful as America and is more similar to us, it probably won't work. And we would need to have those classic army principles or a traditional military doctrine as well. That's my point. Of course, I'm not a military expert. Certainly, our military personnel have thought about some of these things themselves, but we're speaking based on what we see and the information that's being made public. There might also be information that we're not aware of. We can only judge based on what we observe. But for example, some of the things that are being said really make you think, or might even make you angry. For example, regarding the Zulfiqar vessel, The IRIB reporter claims that 3 Zulfiqar vessels can sink a destroyer or an American warship. And this claim is a very strange one. The idea that might have been conveyed to the reporters or that our military commanders might have is that they see the Americans as a big elephant and themselves as bees. And they feel that because the elephant is so big, it can't react very quickly. And a large number of bees, with their multiple stings, can anger it, confuse it, or keep up these small continuous attacks until eventually they bring it down. This is probably the idea that our military commanders have, or at least those who write about the military and support this system emphasize it. But the issue is that an aircraft carrier is accompanied by numerous destroyers that are prepared to defend it against any scenario. And if you consider the aircraft carrier as an elephant and your own vessels as bees, there are probably all sorts of defensive barriers, mosquito repellents, bee killers, fly swatters, or anything else you can imagine surrounding that aircraft carrier to neutralize these threats, so you might not even get close to the carrier. That is, maybe in a training scenario, you set up a mock aircraft carrier and circle around it. You fire so many missiles at it that it might eventually sink, although even then it barely went down. I mean, you all probably still remember the images that were released years ago. Even the mock-up they built was barely sunk using this very system they had in mind. Besides, aircraft carriers really have unique conditions. Even the Americans wanted to sink one of their own carriers for testing purposes. They attacked it with various scenarios, with missiles, with bombings, with naval mines, with torpedoes, with anything you can think of. For 4 weeks, they kept firing American missiles at it, and in the end, the carrier did not sink. That means after 4 weeks of continuous attacks, the carrier did not sink. And in the end, they were only able to sink it with a controlled demolition. Otherwise, it would have remained intact just as it was. An aircraft carrier itself simply does not sink, or if it does, the chances are extremely slim. It's definitely not impossible, but the likelihood is very low. So far, it has never happened that an aircraft carrier has been sunk in this way. However, there are expensive fighter jets on the aircraft carrier and they can be vulnerable. That is, if you can somehow bypass these defense systems and get your missile onto the deck of the aircraft carrier, then you can pose a threat there and, well, target those expensive American fighter jets. But I think hitting those fighters alone won't work, and we're thinking that maybe we tried too hard in the end. We've made a lot of plans. We managed to hit a few of those fighter jets too. But in the end, what's actually going to happen? Are we going to mount an effective defense, or are we going to push the enemy back? Or are we just going to destroy a few of their fighter jets? Now, in the Gulf War video, I'll explain to you that even when the coalition attacked Saddam Hussein's Iraq with that many fighter jets, Saddam still managed to target and shoot down several American fighter jets over Baghdad. But in the end, it made no difference in how he was defeated, and he simply couldn't mount a defense against that scale of repeated attacks with so many different scenarios. That is, if we're going to mount a defense, it has to be an effective one, not just a slap in the face. Slapping someone doesn't do any good. For example, imagine your opponent is armed. You want to slap him. Well, what good does that do except just making him angrier? Of course, I don't mean that you shouldn't even slap him. In the end, a person has to do whatever they possibly can. But now that we're making plans, allocating budgets, or designing scenarios, the scenario should probably be practical so that it can buy us time or at least push the enemy back. If that's not going to happen, then I think there's really no point in just making slogans. Because God forbid, if one day this actually happens and there's a confrontation, after all these slogans, well, people will have expectations. And it would be embarrassing if after people have heard slogans for 30 or 40 years, the defense only lasts a few days in the end. And that's assuming those aircraft carriers even get close enough for the Zulfiqar vessels to reach their area at all. Otherwise, if they're far away, these vessels will even have trouble just getting to those carriers. I mean, even just getting there, making a little noise, and coming back might not even be feasible. Let's move on from this topic so I don't drag it out any longer. What do you think? In your opinion, how useful can these missile cities actually be? Do you think they can protect our defensive equipment against an American attack or not? I read all your comments and I'll respond to as many as I can. Until the next video, take care.